All right, guys. Hi. So, April 22nd, 2020, two key concepts today: maritime empires established as well as maritime empires being maintained and developed. So, remember, maritime has to do with the ocean. Our essential question is, how were these empires of European states established between 1450 and 1750, and what economic and labor systems fueled them? So it's going to really focus on how were they driven economically, so money, and also what types of labor systems did they have to develop to be able to continue to fund this money-making process for the European empires, European states. So first we'll talk about Africa. Trading posts were set up in Africa by the Portuguese because they were the first ones to venture out to that area, and then other European powers would soon follow after them. Some African rulers realized there was a military advantage to exchanging guns for slaves, and they grew very wealthy. Some historians will talk about this, some will not. The majority of slaves that were taken from Africa were taken forcibly by European traders. There were a small group that were, in a way, sold out by their own people, if you will, rival tribes, neighboring tribes. They would give them up in exchange for guns, weapons, goods, and sometimes even protection. They felt that if they could, give the Europeans what they wanted, then maybe they could be guaranteed some form of safety, but that didn't always work. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. You're also going to see West African art begin to depict images of what they call the intruders, and these are Europeans. So in the picture, it's a interpretation of what a Portuguese soldier would have looked like. So you can see him on a horse in his armor, kind of fully dressed, but he is supposed to be an intruder. He's an outsider to this culture. You're going to see the rise of the Asante Empire and the Kingdom of the Congo grow in influence, especially because of the trade, or the amount of trade that they did do with Europeans. So Asante is located near the West African coast. It's the first picture that's there on the top, where that green kind of shaded area is. If you remember, that's also in the same area or territory where like the ancient kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai are. And so it's a very historically significant area because of the continuous amount of presence that's located in that specific region. You're also going to see the Congo grow later, but the Congo is more towards the middle part of Africa. The Portuguese are also going to spread, or their influence is going to spread to the Swahili coast, which happens to be on the East African coast, on the other side of Africa, and that's actually going to throw the region into long-term decline, and that's because it's going to basically take away a lot of the established trade relationships, connections, and networks that the original merchants had developed in this area, and it's going to put them in European powers. Trading posts in Asia. So Japan first. Japan tolerated the Christian missionaries that came from Portuguese and Dutch traders. However, the influence of Christianity grew too strong. So the picture that you guys see up there, it's what's known as the Christian martyrs. Christianity requires an extreme amount of dedication to God. And so if your dedication, if your loyalty, if your allegiance is to God and not to the emperor, to the shogun, to whoever is in charge, it becomes a threat to the current power or to the existing establishments that are holding that authoritative position in that area. And so the Japanese do see this as a threat to their government. So they're going to eventually ban Christian worship, and they will eventually expel Christians from Japan. Also, the foreign influence was a big factor. So they didn't like the fact that foreigners or other Europeans were coming in and filling the heads of the Japanese people with other ideas as well. So books are going to be banned, they're going to be burned. Travel is also going to be limited and eventually banned at some point. The Japanese will allow some Dutch merchants to live on a very secluded island, but the reason they did that is because the Dutch were pretty peaceful. They stuck to themselves. They were largely isolated, and they didn't interfere, and they didn't bother the Japanese that much. They just wanted to kind of be there, and the Japanese kind of said, that's fine with us. China believed that they were superior to the rest of the world. Their goal at the time was to bring back the greatness of China. So this is specifically Ming China. And if you remember, the reason why that is because they were trying to erase all of the Mongol influence that had been inflicted upon them for so many years. So bringing back the greatness of China has a lot to do with bringing back the ethnic traditions of the Chinese culture, and so they did view themselves as superior to other people. They are eventually going to also ban or prohibit foreign trade. They're going to destroy the dockyards because they don't want ships or foreign ships being able to come into their port cities. They're going to limit the size of ships. Remember, we talked about Xing He and the fact that ships couldn't have more than so many masts because they didn't want them traveling far. And they are going to start reconstruction on the Great Wall. The Great Wall isn't one big giant wall. It's actually sections. Most people think it's a big giant wall, but it's actually not. It's pieces. And so they're going to restart construction on pieces of the wall. The ironic thing is that when the wall was originally built, it was built to keep out foreign intruders from the north. It didn't work the first time because they ended up coming to China anyway. And then even after the Ming start to rebuild or reconstruct this current version of the wall, you're going to have them being taken over by the Qing dynasty as well, which are from Manchuria, which are also northerners. So the wall failed. We're going to see some European rivalries, especially when it comes to Indian Ocean trade. So the growth of maritime trade resulted in the growth of these European rivalries. They're competing for power, they're competing for money, they're competing for religion, and they're just competing with each other because they can, and that's what they're doing at the moment. India had numerous European powers that were setting up show in its border. What that means is it's a new area or a territory for them to conquer, so they're going to try and colonize as much of it as they can. You have the British East India Joint Stock Company that is going to be doing some trading with the Mughal Empire. They focused originally on trade, but the East India Trading Company is actually going to gain influence in India, and they're going to increase their political power by making treaties with some local rulers. I'll show you a picture right now. Eventually, Great Britain is actually going to control most of the Indian subcontinent and eventually take it over completely. Portugal controls a small trading post near Goa, which is in Africa, before being pushed out by the British completely in the 20th century. France is going to control Pondicherry in southeast India until the British victory in the 7 Years' War. Sometimes it's also called the French and Indian War, but it just depends. So it's French and Indian War if you're in America. It's the 7 Years' War if you're in Europe. So it does have different names, but it's the same situation. And eventually that will push France out of India completely in about 1763. And Great Britain is really going to establish themselves as a true global empire, creating huge trading posts in the New World, so the Americas, in Africa, and in India. Europe in the Americas. So you have New Spain. New Spain was established by Hernan Cortés and the Spanish Empire after the defeat of the Aztec Empire. So I told you his story. His story was that he portrayed himself as a god and then eventually took down the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs were already weakened by disease. They were weakened with the enslavement of their peoples. The Spaniards melted down much of the Aztec treasures and then sent the gold back to Spain. In South America, you have Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Incas. He actually captured the Incan king Atahualpa for gold. He had actually ransomed him, so he had told them, we'll release your king back to you if you can fill this room up with gold. They did, and he ended up killing the king anyway. So that guy up there is Atahualpa. Eventually, the Inca were completely overthrown by the Spanish in 1572. Spain versus Portugal. So there are going to be some conflicts between these two countries. They are very, very close together geographically in Europe, but they are going to have tensions in the New World because Spain is going to get to the New World first, even though Portugal will be the first European explorers kind of out of the European area. So they are going to come into conflict over territory, over other things. I did mention the Treaty of Tordesillas that was signed by the Pope originally, which divided kind of North America and South America, and it gave a huge chunk and a huge section to the Spanish, and they ended up focusing all their efforts on silver. The Portuguese ended up focusing their efforts on sugar. And at first it went really well for the Spanish because, you know, silver is valuable and it's money and it's currency. But eventually sugar is going to encompass or overthrow silver because it's going to become a major, major, major cash crop. Then we get to France and Great Britain. So France and Great Britain, the natives in the area originally sided with Britain in North America. But the Iroquois, who were a powerful group of Indians, actually switched to the French side when they realized that the British were not their friends. The British were not there to trade or establish connections. They were there to take over. And so they wanted to switch sides and decide to help out the French to defeat the British, but it's actually not going to be successful because Great Britain is going to push France out of Canada in the French and Indian War. In the Treaty of Paris, which officially ends the French and Indian War / the 7 Years' War, France is actually going to lose all of its claims to Canada, and it's going to give Louisiana to Spain, while Britain received Spanish Florida, Upper Canada, and various French holdings overseas. So overall, it was a loss for the French Empire. Europe in the Indian Ocean trade. So trade continued largely undisturbed in the Indian Ocean. Merchants were already used to paying taxes, so these trading posts, these passports, these permits, it wasn't anything new to them. It was actually taxes that helped keep order, not guns, and that was until the Europeans arrived. Portugal in the Indian Ocean led the way, or they led the charge, because they had a superior navy, but they also had religious zeal, and that's kind of like an extreme enthusiasm for religion. They had the backing of the church behind them also, so that's also a big boost in ego, if you will. They set up those armed trading posts, so forts along the coast. They would eventually beat the Gujarati, the Mamluks, and the Zamorin to establish dominance in the area. So they would beat out local groups that had originally held dominance at some point to become the more dominant force themselves. And then after that, things mostly stayed the same. People just now ended up paying taxes to the Portuguese instead of to those other groups. The Indian Ocean slave trade is a little bit different than the African slave trade. So the Indian Ocean slave trade had existed for many, many years prior to the Atlantic slave trade. The African slaves were taken to North Africa, the Middle East, and India. Slaves had different fates in the Indian Ocean trade. And slavery is obviously a very negative thing, a very, very bad thing. But if you were taken to the Indian Ocean, you were granted more freedoms, a little bit more liberties, as opposed to being taken to the New World or other places because of triangular trade. Slaves that were taken to the Indian Ocean could work in the home as domestic slaves or as laborers. They were allowed to live in the towns and the cities. They were able to create diasporic communities, which means they could stick together and they could travel together. And then in some groups, they could even have the potential to marry people of their own choosing. So they did have more freedoms in this area. They're still slaves, but they were given a little bit more freedom versus other places, other locations. So the picture that you see there, the majority of them are going and being taken from different parts of the area. You see a large number being taken from the middle. I'm trying to point, but I'm really, really bad at this. But it's about right in the middle where you see like the Nile River and taken to Egypt. You also see a big, huge chunk being taken from the East African coast where like Ethiopia is the Horn of Africa, and then being taken to Saudi Arabia. So the thicker the arrows, the more amount of slaves being taken to that region. The thinner the arrows, the less amount of slaves being taken to that region, basically. Okay, so silver and gold. Columbus originally thought that there was lots and lots and lots of gold in the New World. A lot of it had to do with legends, like the city of El Dorado, where the streets are, paved in gold, and other stories that had been told before. Indians or Native Americans or Aztecs, wore lots of gold and jewelry decor on their face, and so they thought that these people were, dripping in gold. But when they went and settled there and took over, they didn't actually find a whole lot of gold for themselves, and they almost gave up at some point. There isn't a whole lot of gold in the Caribbean. So instead, they decided to enslave the people, because they figured if they can't make money off of gold and silver, well, they can at least sell the people. Eventually, later, silver is going to be discovered in Mexico and in Peru. You're going to see Bolivia in parentheses. In the previous lesson, I mentioned Bolivia, because today it is the country of Bolivia, but at the time it was Peru. So Peru wouldn't have been divided yet. That's going to come later. So it's essentially both. At the time it would have been called Peru. Today we call it Bolivia. So silver mining in Mexico and Peru flourished. It made Spain incredibly wealthy. The problem is that because of disease and because of the horrible treatment of people, thousands upon thousands were dying, and many of them refused to do the toughest work. So this encouraged the Spanish to reinstitute the Incan Mita system. Originally, the Mita system was a volunteer system. You do your time, 2 years community service, or however time community service, and then you're never called upon or asked again. This Mita system that was reincorporated by the Spanish is much more a slave-based system, and it required cities, villages, towns to send a certain amount of young men each year or annually to go provide work for the silver mines. And it was very dangerous work. A lot of the times you didn't survive the work. It's backbreaking labor. The mines would collapse. You could die from diseases having to do with respiratory illness and just overall exhaustion in general. You're talking about working 18 hours a day in complete darkness. So really, really, really dangerous. And they would use the wealth from these silver mines to help build up their military. Eventually, though, like I did mention, inflation is going to play a role in this economically. Inflation is kind of like when money loses its value, and so it's going to lose its value and it's going to negatively impact the economy. Okay, so when Columbus first sailed in 1492, it's the Blue Line. So he sails from Portugal, and he sails and he lands in what he would call... It's a toss-up, because remember, he thought he landed in India, or he thought he was discovering a new route to India, so he had called them Indians, but he really landed probably somewhere near the Bahamas, or what eventually would be called Hispaniola. So he doesn't actually land on the continental part of North America. The other different colored voyages are going to be the territories or the routes that he took several times. So he overall made 4 different voyages back and forth to this territory, to this area. Okay, so then we get to the forced labor and the coerced labor. Spain is actually going to incorporate and use 2 different systems. They're going to use the hacienda system and they're going to use the encomienda system. The hacienda system is when indigenous or native people are forced to work on farms in the New World to grow wheat, fruit, vegetables, and sugar. The picture you can see shows a slave being grossly mistreated by a European Spaniard. The encomienda system is a little bit different because this one would encourage landowners to hire indigenous people to work for them in exchange for shelter. They really weren't hired. They weren't paid wages. They were also treated very, very harshly. The only difference is that they lived in the plantations pretty much. And then the Mita system I already mentioned, they took it from the original Incan idea. The African slave trade in the New World is going to be a little bit different. The thing that greatly drove the African slave trade is that when the New World was discovered and they came, the Indians died out. If you remember, it's 50 to 90% of the population was wiped out because of these diseases like smallpox, malaria, influenza, and measles. And so you have a huge loss in population, 1. 2, if you're a native of the land, you're going to know your way around places and you're going to be able to find a way to escape. So those people that didn't die from disease were able to run away, escape, and try and rebuild lives somewhere else. And so they are at a loss of people, a workforce. And so they're going to have to find people to come and work for them. And so they end up going to Africa. Some African kingdoms, like I mentioned, were involved in the capturing of slaves. The horrible thing is that about 10 to 15, and this number is probably wrong. This number is probably a lot higher. The majority of them actually died in the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is the traveling from Africa to the Americas, whether it was north or south. And it disrupted demographics in Africa. The majority of the slaves that were taken were men. And so it left a huge number of women that were left behind. And then it would also leave African governments very, very unstable. They would never be able to kind of create or solidify a very strong infrastructure, which is going to leave Africa weak and behind even for several centuries. These are just some pictures or depictions of what slave ships looked like. So they were packed to the rim. And then if somebody died along the passage, their body was just thrown overboard. There was no regard for them as humans. They were treated as cattle. They were treated horribly. And it was just unspeakable conditions. The Middle Passage that I was talking about is the one that goes from Africa to North America or South America, depending on which plantation they're going to be working at. Alright, so we get to 4.5, the essential question. What economic strategies did maritime empires use to increase their power, and how did the developing empires affect political, economic, religious, and cultural dynamics? Whew, that's a long one. I'll take a little break real quick. My Diet Coke. Okay, so Some economic strategies in the commercial revolution. The shift towards a global economic, or the global economy, was using gold and silver. It becomes known as the commercial revolution, which is marked by 4 things. 1, the development of overseas colonies. 2, the opening of new ocean trade routes. 3, population growth. And 4, inflation, which I talked about, money being worth less. This eventually also becomes known as a price revolution. Joint stock companies like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company are going to finance trade and exploration. This is going to be different, guys, and it's going to be huge. Earlier empires were financed by state-sponsored excursions, which means the government controls everything. These joint stock companies are, they're privately owned. So they're owned by people. What ends up happening is that these companies go and reach out to investors, wealthy people, people with money, and they ask them to buy portions of corporations, like kind of like buying shares in stock, like you own a piece of the company. And this would in turn finance the trade. It was actually safer for people to invest, because if you were the sole proprietor, if you were the sole owner and you invested all your money in a business and your business failed, well, you are 100% responsible for loss of profits. If you go into business with other people and you guys share the responsibility, it's a lot more limited risk and there's a lot less chance of you losing all of your money versus some of your money. So it's actually going to become the driving force behind a lot of exploration during this time. Some other strategies, the Dutch are going to become extremely wealthy. They were pioneers in finance. They were incredibly intelligent. They had stock exchange. They were the middlemen of European trade. People loved the Dutch. And they also had their own banks to trade currencies, to trade money, which made them very, very profitable because they didn't have to go through anybody else. They were the ones who handled it themselves. The British and the French are going to be a lot less lucky, and that is because a lot of them still had state-sponsored excursions or travel. They are going to go through a process known as overlending. So they're going to borrow more money than they actually have. And eventually this economic bubble is going to burst and it's going to hurt the British economy, but also the French economy as well. Some changes for the indigenous people. Land-based empires were a little bit different than maritime empires. Land-based empires like the Romans, the Muslims, and the Mongols struggled with what to do with conquered people. A lot of the times what they would do is that they would allow these people to keep their traditions, to assimilate, to blend in, or to mix. Many times that was the case. Maritime empires tried to eradicate or erase cultures completely and redo social structures altogether. So like in Latin America, they completely replaced the Indians' ways of doing things, especially the Spanish and the Portuguese. Spain appointed what was known as a viceroy. They would act as the arm of the king in the New World, and they were kind of like the head of the court system. The viceroy could hold these things called audiencias, or like a court, and it was the job of the viceroy to hear people's complaints, to handle all the issues in Spain. The king in Spain was too busy, and he was all the way in Spain. He didn't care what was going on in the Americas. If he's getting his money, I don't care. Just send me my money, send me my taxes, I'm good, leave me alone. You deal with it. And that's pretty much what happened. So a lot of these viceroys were very, very corrupt, and things didn't get done the way they should have gotten done. Most indigenous books were burned because they were seen as, I'm trying to think of the right word, but when the Spanish came and the Portuguese came, they converted the Indians to Christianity. Anything that goes against Christianity is considered heretical or heresy, or it's against God, and so therefore it's bad, it's evil, it's wrong, they're going to burn it, they're going to destroy it. So very few original accounts of Aztec history actually exist. What we do know, we know from records that they left behind, artifacts that they left behind, but very, very few accounts are written down historically as far as, stories. Most of it is passed down through oral tradition from culture to culture, or it was told from the European standpoint, and Spanish is actually going to become the main language of this territory, this area. Lastly, changes for indigenous people, you're going to have religious syncretism. So this is the blending of religions. With the creation of, or mixing, I should say, of African and Indian cultures mixing with Christianity, you're going to see new types of religion pop up. So this is known as religious syncretism. Syncretism means blending. So they're going to blend the old existing traditions that they know with the Christian beliefs to kind of assimilate, to help them become more responsive or adaptive to the new types of things being imposed on them, because these religions were pretty much imposed on them. 1 out of 10 Africans practice Islam, and the very first were they were the first Muslim presence in the world. Natives were very hesitant to give up the old ways, so what they ended up doing, and what a lot of Christian priests did, is that they associated these early gods with other types of Christian saints and martyrs to be like, look, we have the same thing, we just call them different things. So you are going to see a lot of these things translate over and carry over to different religions. So you're going to see the cult of the Virgen de Guadalupe. I talked about her. She has a very strong significance for the people of Mexico. She's very revered in Mexico. People put shrines of her all over the place. There was an Aztec goddess known as Tontezin, and so they associate her a lot with that Aztec goddess. So it was a way to kind of merge the cultures, merge the beliefs. You're going to have voodoo or vodun or hoodoo, which is a blending of African culture and Christianity. You're going to have candomblé and santeria, which is also a blending and mixing of African cultures with types of Christianity. The idea is that these saints, these spirits, carry the same power and same capability as Christian saints and power. So you're going to see altars, you're going to see traditions, you're going to see feast days, you're going to see a lot of blending happening between these groups and these cultures. And Christian missionaries are actually so successful that Roman Catholic Christianity is going to become the most dominant religion even to this day in Latin America. Okay, so your exit ticket is to review information on religions, all religions, for the beginning of time. No, just kidding. The major ones, you're going to have a DBQ again this Friday. It's going to be about various religions. That's all I'm going to tell you about. It's going to be timed again. It's going to be on Google Classroom. More information to follow. I'm not giving you an assignment because I want you to spend time reviewing the videos, reviewing your notes, and reviewing the modified rubric to make sure that you guys are familiar with how you're going to be graded. I sent out a pretty angry message that a lot of you still have not turned in your first DBQ. You need to make sure you turn that in so I can give you feedback and so you can be graded. Other than that, I hope you guys have a good day. See you later. Adios. Au revoir. Arrivederci. Auf Wiedersehen. Bye.